All right, thanks. My name is Nick. I'm a PhD student at UCSB, and I'm excited to talk about some of my research and learn from everybody else who's speaking today. Before I get into it, I want to make sure I thank my funding sources, collaborators, everybody who's made this project possible and successful thus far. So my research focuses on balancing biodiversity benefits of our restoration projects, thinking about how we can meet our restoration goals, as well as balancing that against feasibility of these projects and these different tools and techniques. So something that works on a small scale may not necessarily work at a large scale. So I work in ice plant dominated landscapes along our coastline. Ice plant, I'm sure many of us know, invasive species from South Africa, forms dense monocultures, displaces our native plant communities, and has negative implications for biodiversity, ecosystem function, etc. I'm lucky enough I get to study it out at the Dangerman Preserve, really special place, as we've already mentioned, culturally, biogeographically, ecologically, and therefore sets a good stage to think about invasive species management in these relatively intact coastal habitats. And lucky for me, unlucky for the Nature Conservancy, there's a lot of ice plant at the Dangerman Preserve. They have about 1,000 acres of the preserve that's currently dominated by ice plant. And they have this really awesome goal of removing that and restoring it to native coastal habitat. And we have a lot of examples to draw on for that. And when we think of restoration of ice plant and these coastal ecosystems, there's so many different factors to consider. What's our ecosystem we're actually trying to restore? Is it a grassland? Is it a wetland? Coastal sage scrub? How do we remove that ice plant or whatever invader we're dealing with? How do we get native plants established? And how do we deal with secondary weeds coming in afterwards, returning ice plant, etc. And on top of that, when we're working in a 1,000-acre scale, we really need to consider, like I mentioned, these time and cost constraints that might limit the actions we can actually use at these sites. So for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to focus on this third part, or the fun part, to me at least, establishing our native plants in these communities. And in restoration, as many of us know, there's fairly simple goals at this stage. We want to get native plants, get native cover on the landscape, and increase our native species diversity, right? So what did we actually do? So we had 3 treatments for native plant establishment. The one not pictured here is a sort of do-nothing approach where we go in, we set up our restoration plots, we remove the ice plant, and we let nature do its thing and hopefully recruit natives on its own. And then the more active approaches pictured here, we have planting and seeding, fairly straightforward, plant native shrubs into the ground, or go out and spread seeds onto the landscape. And right off the bat, seeding has a big advantage when we think about the time and cost constraints. Seeding is fairly quick and easy, just spreading the seeds, whereas planting takes a lot of time. And for reference, it took me by myself 1 day to seed the same amount of area that it took a team of roughly 20 folks over the course of like 11 work days to plant. So right off the bat, seeding seems to have an advantage. But does it actually meet our restoration goals? When we look at native cover, yes, it does. So we see a slight advantage, not a huge difference between seeding and planting, where seeding does the best at getting native cover on the ground. Doing nothing, as you can see, was relatively unsuccessful. But the pattern switches a little bit when we look at native richness. So a metric for diversity, right? Just how many native species we have at our restoration site. We see that planting really does a better job here. Seeding is great and we can get good cover, but just because we spread the seeds, it doesn't necessarily mean that all those species are going to germinate, right? And that's really what we saw. We saw a few species dominate the seeded plots, whereas the planted ones, we got a lot higher diversity. So how can we take that and come back to our large scale, this 1,000 acres, and think about what's our restoration strategy here? So we can go in, delineate our area, say it's 50 acres, 100 acres, 500, whatever it may be. And maybe the strategy then is let's go in and let's seed it all. We know this is pretty quick. We know we're going to get good cover. Maybe we're going to lose a little bit of that species diversity goal. These circles here just represent a couple species dominating the landscape. But then we can come back and we can plant small subsections of this area, right? And we're not going to be able to cover a huge amount of ground that way. But we can really up that localized diversity. And this way we can sort of manage for these trade-offs between these different restoration tools and techniques we have while maintaining a cost-effective overall approach to managing, 1,000 acres. So thank you. Okay. Yeah.
So seeding versus planting, like seeding seems like more of a natural, if we're thinking about like successional states, and maybe you don't have that diversity, but you gain that diversity maybe later, versus like with planting, it seems like you're almost creating a state and maybe skipping some of that by intentionally putting things in. So I'm just wondering if maybe with the seeding it eventually catches up in terms of richness.
Yeah, totally. So this data just comes from the first year after seeding. So it's totally possible I go back out this summer and all of a sudden, oh, here's the other 5 species or whatever, right? So that's totally possible. I think another piece of it too is that it's potentially also equally possible that the planting is sort of necessary to get over that hurdle for some certain species. I don't know all the mechanisms that could be driving that, but it's possible that beyond just dispersal availability, that like even if those seeds are there, there's something else going on in the system that doesn't allow the more rare species to actually successfully germinate, or maybe they are germinating and then they die off really early and we're just not catching that. So yeah, I think seeing this through the next few years is going to be really important to say how consistent are these patterns. But yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, yeah, Mark.
Great stuff, Mitch. Thank you. What's happening in the no action plots?
Is that your second question?
Yeah.
Not much. We get like a few cool little disturbance following natives, like there's some Amsinkias and things like that popping up, a couple red maids and things here and there in the areas where we had some, I glossed over it, but some more intense like ice plant management where there's a little bit more disturbance. So we do see things popping up. But in terms of meeting restoration goals, it's just not quite there because it stays open. And what we're seeing then is a few cool little native wildflowers and things, but it seems like the ice plant will slowly start creeping back in, which is what we definitely don't want, to go back to square one, where at least if we can get, even when the seeded plots where we're getting a couple species dominating, we have some data that suggests once we get a good cover of that sage scrub, it's going to be relatively more invasion resistant. So yeah, I want to keep monitoring it, and then because that would be the perfect, right? If we could just get rid of the ice plant and then our natives come back, that would be awesome. But it seems like that's maybe not super realistic. Yeah.
Do you mind after the full scale of that ice plant restoration is seed supply an issue or not?
Yeah, totally. I think what we've discussed as a team and is sort of thinking of it as we're not going to do 1,000 acres in a 1-year cycle, but sort of, I don't know, like a leapfrog sort of approach where we like chunk off 100 acres or 50 acres, whatever seems manageable for a yearly seed supply. Start there and we seed this first section. And then, year 2, we'll start on the next section and maybe go back and plant year 1 and sort of like do it that way so that you can slowly work through that whole 1,000 acres. And we've had success. Lisa's group at UCSB has done a similar thing, a much smaller scale at Campus Point, where, you slowly like break off a chunk at a time. Yeah.
Can you imagine producing the seed locally? They're sort of anticipating that you're going to need to keep a supply going for a number of years. Has that been discussion at all?
Yeah, that would be a great question for Laura. I don't know if is she, but anyway,
it seems like it's kind of a perennial problem is how do you get the seed supply at the scale to do some of these big projects?
Totally. And for this project, all the seed was collected locally on the preserve, or at least within watershed and things. So this is a smaller pilot study, but I think that's the plan, is to sort of set up ways to get, even like for some of the really common species, just even if we on site have a plot of just like tons of Eriogonum and just collect from there every year, I think that's totally feasible as well.
We get a lot of lessons learned from what Lisa's been doing, obviously.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think for your cost, you might not have incorporated the cost of collecting the seed.
Yeah, and I'm ignoring the cost of growing the plants, so yeah, just like that action phase, but yeah, if you add all those other things up, yeah,
Great.
more to consider.
Nicole.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, that's great. I just was wondering, if this is representative, how did you select those, the smaller plots of planting? How do you make that selection where?
For the location we put them?
And doing smaller plots of planting, yeah, how do you make that selection where those planting areas?
Yeah, so we have like block, like, yeah, it's a block design. So we have these blocks of plots spread out through throughout the site, and we just basically more or less cut them into quarters of like, there's like individual planting plots. There's like 50 times 6 essentially to give you a scope. So they're sort of spread out throughout the landscape, and then the seeded ones are right next to them. So they're kind of, yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I can give you the whole spiel on how we set it. Yeah, Nicole.
I'm curious with, about which species were dominant and were successful through your seeding practices, and whether that varied across the landscape. Like, were there some microsites where you saw, dominance change?
Yeah. So the 2 species that dominated were Eriogonum parvifolium, seacliff buckwheat, and then Artemisia californica. Coastal sagebrush, yeah, right? California sagebrush. So those ones really dominated. As we got closer to the cliffs and like a more sandy setting, more duny setting, the Eriogonum was really like the dominant one. Like there's Artemisias mixed in, but it's really that. If we move further from the coast, a little up towards, the railroad of further away, the Artemisia sort of plays a bigger role there. And that's fairly true in the planted plots as well. Planted plots, we see like Encelia does pretty well. Monkey flower does pretty well. And those kind of things. And with the planted one, there's a little less variation. It's sort of like, because we planted them, we put them everywhere, and the ones that survive. But yeah, that's definitely an important factor that I haven't totally wrapped my head around how to visualize yet. But
Yeah, I think those gradients will be important as you scale this.
totally, yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
How are you managing your weeds?
We have a number of different treatments from like different, most of it's chemical herbicides. At scale, that's sort of the best we have, but we have different treatments in terms of how often we treat and how intensely we go about it. So like treating every couple weeks or every month and a half basically throughout the whole growing season, or just do 2 sort of upfront and call it good there. So we have, it gets a little more complicated when I add that in, which is why I skipped over it, but
Well, the reason I ask is, have you found any legless lizards as you're pulling out the ice cream?
I haven't seen legless lizards, no. Lots of alligator lizards. Yeah, Mark's shaking his head no, but they haven't been seen out there. Okay, yeah, I'll look out for them. Yeah. All right, sorry if that was.